March 23, 1943, Guettar, Tunisia. The desert wind howled across the barren valley, carrying with it the sting of sand and the metallic scent of burnt oil. Dawn had barely broken when the first German shells came shrieking down from the ridgeline, erupting in geysers of smoke and earth around the American positions. Amid the chaos, a figure stood tall atop a half-track, binoculars in hand, his battered helmet tilted slightly forward. Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen, commander of the U.S. 1st Infantry Division, better known as the Big Red One. Allen's men called him Terrible Terry, not because he was cruel, but because he was fearless. The kind of leader who slept in a foxhole, cursed like a soldier, and would rather die beside his men than command them from safety. His jeep, scarred and dust-caked, bore no markings of rank. Allen believed that every man, from private to general, bled the same color when the fighting began. This morning, however, even Allen knew they faced something different. The 10th Panzer Division, hardened veterans of North Africa, had moved in with Tiger tanks and mobile artillery. The American infantry, still new to large-scale desert warfare, hunkered down as German armor began its advance. Allen climbed down, his boots sinking into the coarse sand, and shouted over the roar of engines. "No one gives an inch," he barked. "Hold your ground, make the bastards pay for every foot." Nearby, Captain William Darby's Rangers prepared their bazookas, sweat streaming down their dust-streaked faces. The smell of cordite filled the air as the first bazooka round whooshed toward an approaching panzer, striking its treads and sending it grinding to a halt in flames. Allen moved through the line, slapping shoulders, shouting encouragement, utterly unfazed by the artillery pounding the ridges. He had learned long ago, during the muddy, chaotic battles of World War I, that leadership wasn't about medals or speeches. It was about presence. Soldiers needed to see their general when everything was collapsing around them. As the battle raged, the 1st Division held firm. Hours turned into a blur of smoke, shrapnel, and grit. Finally, by mid-afternoon, the German assault began to waver. Reports came through that Allen's men had captured dozens of prisoners, including several tank crews who'd abandoned their wrecked machines. When the firing finally subsided, Allen lit a cigarette with trembling hands, the exhaustion momentarily visible in his eyes. He looked across the battlefield, the smoking hulks of German armor, the torn desert earth, the weary faces of his men, and muttered to himself, "We're not green anymore." That night, under a blanket of cold stars, Allen sat beside a campfire with his officers. They shared rations, jokes, and silence. For them, Guettar wasn't just a victory. It was proof that American soldiers, under the right command, could stand toe-to-toe with Hitler's finest. But for Allen, it was only the beginning. The same ferocity that made him unstoppable in combat would soon draw fire from his own superiors. Men who couldn't understand that true leadership sometimes looked more like defiance than discipline. The Germans now knew his name, and they would learn to fear it. December 1912, West Point, New York. Snow drifted quietly over the stone courtyard of the U.S. Military Academy. Cadet Terry de la Mesa Allen, son of an Army officer and descendant of a proud lineage of soldiers, stood before the review board, shoulders squared, jaw tight. He had failed out. His academic record was abysmal. Too many demerits, too many clashes with authority. But what stung most wasn't the failure itself, it was the look of disappointment he imagined on his father's face. West Point was supposed to make him a soldier. Instead, it had cast him aside. Yet, even then, Allen wasn't the type to bow his head. Rather than surrender his dream, he enrolled at Catholic University in Washington, D.C., earning his commission the hard way, through grit, perseverance, and sheer defiance. By 1917, as the world erupted into war, Lieutenant Allen sailed for France with the 90th Infantry Division, determined to prove that a man's worth wasn't defined by grades or titles, but by courage under fire. In the mud-choked trenches of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, Allen's instincts for battle came alive. He watched, learned, and adapted faster than any manual could teach. While others hesitated, Allen improvised, launching night attacks when the enemy least expected, using silence and confusion as weapons. It was unconventional, even reckless. But it worked. During one assault, His unit crept forward under the cover of darkness, bayonets fixed, faces streaked with mud. They struck a German outpost at dawn, overrunning it before the defenders could even raise their rifles. The tactic was crude but brilliant, the kind of innovation born from desperation and intuition. It would become Allen's signature decades later in Europe. When the guns finally fell silent in 1918, Allen emerged from the trenches with scars, promotions, and a reputation. Fellow officers described him as fearless, stubborn, and impossible to intimidate. But peacetime never suited men like Terry Allen. He was a soldier meant for chaos, not ceremony. Between the wars, as the U.S. Army shrank and stagnated, Allen's career faltered. He spoke too bluntly, drank too freely, and often ignored the rigid protocols of military life. Yet those same flaws would become his strengths when the world caught fire again. By 1942, America needed leaders who could fight, not just follow orders. The call came for officers who could think fast, act faster, and turn raw recruits into warriors. That's when Terry Allen's name re-emerged, a relic of the last war, suddenly indispensable in the new one. He was placed in command of the 1st Infantry Division, a force destined to spearhead America's first major offensive of World War II. To his men, he was rough around the edges, unpredictable, but deeply loyal. He cursed like them, bled like them, and refused to dine anywhere that didn't serve coffee in tin mugs. As Allen prepared to lead his division across the seas to North Africa, he told his officers, "The Germans think we're amateurs. We'll show them how dangerous amateurs can be." Soon, the desert would test every lesson he had ever learned, and every rule he had ever broken. November 8, 1942, Oran, Algeria. The Atlantic swells slapped against the hull of the USS Mount Vernon, tossing soldiers like rag dolls as the transport ship inched closer to North Africa. Terry Allen stood at the railing, binoculars in hand, his coat flapping in the wind. The horizon was a blur of gray water and dark clouds, but beyond it lay the war-torn sands of Tunisia, where the fate of the first American offensive in the European theater would be decided. Allen's 1st Infantry Division, freshly minted, a mix of battle-ready veterans and raw recruits, was about to meet its first taste of modern mechanized warfare. Tanks, artillery, and seasoned German troops awaited them, and the desert itself would be an unforgiving adversary. Within hours of landing, Allen had moved his men inland, mapping out positions and reviewing reconnaissance reports. He ignored the ceremonial cautions of senior staff, opting instead to walk the front lines himself, speaking to privates and sergeants, learning their strengths and weaknesses. He knew the enemy would target the inexperienced. He intended to mold them into soldiers who could survive and fight back. At Guettar, the 1st Infantry faced their first major test. The 10th Panzer Division had entrenched itself along the ridges overlooking the valley, and their panzers and 88 mm guns made the open desert a death trap. But Allen, true to his reputation, devised a daring plan. Small, coordinated night assaults that disrupted German positions, coupled with relentless day patrols to pin them down. By the second week of March, the division had engaged in a brutal series of encounters. Smoke from destroyed tanks hung over the valley like a dark cloud, mingling with the scent of scorched sand and gunpowder. Allen, perched atop his half-track, shouted commands through the roar of artillery, his voice cutting across chaos. "Hold the line. Don't let them move an inch." He moved through trenches and foxholes, inspecting wounds, checking ammo, and delivering words of encouragement. When a squad hesitated, Allen personally grabbed a machine gun and led a flanking maneuver, proving by example that fear was the only enemy that could not be killed. By dawn, the Germans began to retreat. Captured prisoners spoke of an American general who led from the front, who seemed to appear wherever the fight was fiercest. Rumors spread through the German lines, "That terrible Terry Allen is everywhere. He does not fear death." Allen's tactics, honed in World War I, had become a template for modern combined arms desert warfare. His men had learned to fight as a unit, to trust their instincts, and to respect a commander who never asked them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. Yet, despite the victory, Allen knew the desert had only shown him a fraction of the war's true ferocity. Sicily awaited, and with it, a campaign that would push his division, and himself, to the very edge of human endurance. The Germans had learned a name, the Americans had gained a legend. July 10, 1943, Gela, Sicily. The roar of naval guns and the pounding surf filled the pre-dawn air. Soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division huddled in landing craft, water lapping at their knees, faces streaked with fear and salt. Terry Allen stood at the bow, helmet tilted, eyes scanning the black horizon where faint flashes of artillery illuminated the Italian coastline. This was the beginning of Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily, a campaign that would test not only his men's courage but his unorthodox leadership to the limit. As the ramps dropped, Allen plunged into the chaos alongside his soldiers. Mortar fire exploded in the surf, hurling sand and spray into the screaming infantry. The beaches were a gauntlet. Tanks bogged down in soft sand, mines tore through landing craft, and machine gun nests raked the advancing Americans. But Allen's presence cut through the panic. He moved between units, his voice carrying over the noise. Eyes up! Keep moving! Cover each other! Where commanders might have relied on maps and radio reports, Allen relied on instinct. He personally directed artillery strikes, adjusted troop movements, and even commandeered a jeep to lead a flanking maneuver around a German strongpoint that threatened to halt the division's advance. Soldiers later recalled seeing him jump onto a sandbagged ridge, waving his revolver, urging men forward while bullets ricocheted around him. Under Allen's leadership, the 1st Division pressed inland. The streets of Gela became a deadly maze. Buildings crumbled under artillery fire, windows shattered, and the scent of smoke, blood, and sweat mingled into a suffocating haze. Allen's men, once raw and hesitant, fought with precision, moving house to house, clearing enemy positions in coordinated strikes that mimicked the night attack tactics Allen had perfected decades earlier. Yet victory came at a cost. Casualties mounted, and the strain of relentless combat weighed heavily. Allen, ever the stoic presence, refused to retreat to headquarters. Instead, he bivouacked with his troops, sharing meager rations, listening to their fears, and reminding them why they fought. His unorthodox methods and relentless demands drew criticism from superiors. Reports described him as difficult, insubordinate, and reckless. But his soldiers revered him. They saw in Allen a general who would not ask them to risk their lives for anything less than victory. By the end of the Sicilian campaign, the Americans had secured key objectives, paving the way for the invasion of mainland Italy. Allen's men emerged battle-hardened, disciplined, and loyal, a testament to the transformative power of a leader who led from the front, who demanded excellence, and who never faltered in the face of danger. But even as the accolades poured in, whispers of tension grew in the higher echelons of command. Allen's methods, though effective, clashed with conventional military thinking. His audacity and disregard for protocol would soon make him a controversial figure, one whose career teetered on the edge of triumph and disgrace. The legend of Terrible Terry was solidifying, and the Germans would remember his name long before he faced the most testing chapter of his career. August 1943, Italy. The Italian sun beat down mercilessly over the rugged Sicilian hills. Terry Allen, fresh from victories at Gela and Troina, reviewed maps with his staff, the lines of battle stretching like veins across the island. His men were tired but disciplined, ready for the next push into mainland Italy. Yet, despite the success, Allen's world was about to shift in ways he could neither predict nor control. Reports arrived from higher command. Allen was to be relieved of command of the 1st Infantry Division. The reason was murky. Some cited insubordination, others claimed he was too reckless, unwilling to adhere to rigid procedures. Allen, a man defined by results rather than red tape, listened in silence. "I lead soldiers, not papers," he muttered, crumpling the report in his hand. His men were stunned. Privates, sergeants, and officers alike knew the reasoning was as hollow as it was bureaucratic. They had followed Allen through fire and smoke, through deserts and beaches, and he had delivered victory after victory. To remove him now was more than a slight, it was a betrayal. Allen left the division quietly, packing his gear with the stoicism of a man who understood that war demanded sacrifices beyond the battlefield. Yet even in departure, his influence lingered. His training methods, his tactical innovations, and the esprit de corps he instilled remained, ensuring the 1st Infantry Division continued to perform at the highest levels. But Terry Allen was not done. The war still raged across Europe, and another opportunity awaited, one that would allow him to rebuild, to train a new generation of soldiers in the way he knew best. In 1944, he took command of the 104th Infantry Division, the Timberwolves. This was a green unit, filled with recruits fresh from civilian life, untested and unshaped. For most generals, this would be a daunting assignment. For Allen, it was a canvas. He implemented rigorous training programs, often pushing his men to exhaustion. Night maneuvers became routine. Simulated assaults tested their nerves and instincts. He demanded discipline, yes, but also ingenuity, teaching soldiers to think like the enemy, anticipate attacks, and exploit weaknesses. By the time the Timberwolves shipped out for the European theater, they were no longer green. They were elite night fighters, capable of striking fear into the hearts of seasoned German defenders. Allen's return to command was more than a comeback. It was a redemption, not just for himself, but for the American soldier. Under his guidance, the Timberwolves would prove that unconventional leadership, relentless training, and unflinching courage could turn raw recruits into one of the most effective combat forces in the war. The Germans, who had already whispered his name in fear during North Africa and Sicily, would soon learn that terrible Terry Allen had not diminished. He had returned, stronger and deadlier than ever. September 19, 1944, Error, Lorraine, France. Morning fog hung low over the rolling hills, softening the edges of the forested landscape and concealing the rumble of approaching enemy forces. Terry Allen's 104th Infantry Division, the Timberwolves, moved like shadows through the mist, their boots sinking into the damp earth, rifles at the ready. Allen rode in the lead jeep, binoculars pressed to his eyes, his face unreadable but every motion precise, every decision calculated. This was the European theater in full fury. Belgium and Holland awaited, territories thick with German resistance, fortified villages, and hidden snipers. But Allen's men had been trained to fight in the dark, to strike when the enemy thought themselves safe, and to trust their commander implicitly. He stopped briefly at a crossroads, crouched beside a platoon hunkered behind a low stone wall. The Timberwolves were tense but disciplined, moving with a quiet energy that spoke of hours of night drills, simulated assaults, and relentless preparation. "Listen to the forest," Allen whispered, almost to himself. "They'll tell you where they are." By mid-morning, the first contact erupted. German defenders, caught off guard by the Timberwolves' stealth and aggression, were pushed back with brutal efficiency. Machine gun fire ripped through the fog, artillery exploded in the distance, and the screams of both men and engines filled the air. Allen was everywhere at once, directing fire, adjusting positions, shouting orders, yet always moving at the front with his soldiers. Through September and into October, the Timberwolves carved a path across Belgium and Holland. German forces, many veteran soldiers, were unnerved by the division's relentless night attacks. Entire towns fell under the cover of darkness before the defenders could mount an organized response. Prisoners whispered fearfully of the American general whose troops struck with surgical precision at unexpected hours. Allen's leadership style, controversial to some, proved devastatingly effective. He trusted his soldiers' initiative, encouraged audacity, and rewarded ingenuity. Every success reinforced loyalty, every failure became a lesson drilled into the next maneuver. The Timberwolves became a force that the Germans dreaded encountering, a shadow in the night that could appear anywhere and everywhere. But victory carried personal cost. Allen bore the weight of command not just through strategy, but through the losses of the young men under his charge. The forests and villages of Western Europe became a testament to courage, sacrifice, and the unflinching resolve of a general who had learned that leadership was as much about enduring grief as it was about winning battles. By the time the Timberwolves reached Germany, the legend of Terrible Terry Allen had grown. His name was feared by enemies, respected by allies, and etched into the memory of every soldier who had fought under him. From the deserts of North Africa to the forests of Europe, one American general had redefined courage and command, and left an indelible mark on the Second World War. April 1945, Germany. The war in Europe was drawing to a close. Terry Allen's Timberwolves had carved a path of relentless precision across Belgium, Holland, and into the heart of Germany. Town after town had been liberated, enemy positions neutralized, and the morale of German defenders shattered. But for Allen, victory was never about headlines or medals. It was about the men beside him, the soldiers who had endured grueling nights, constant danger, and the unyielding discipline he demanded. In the ruins of a German village, Allen walked among the Timberwolves, surveying the destruction and the cost. Bombed-out buildings cast long shadows across cobblestone streets, and the air was heavy with smoke and the acrid scent of war. His men moved silently, exhausted but disciplined, carrying the wounded and securing prisoners. Allen paused at the edge of a field, watching the sun break through the clouds. His thoughts drifted to personal loss, the shadow that would follow him long after the guns fell silent. His son, a soldier in a later conflict, would be killed in Vietnam. The personal cost of service and sacrifice weighed heavily on him, a reminder that the war had exacted more than tactical victories. Yet his legacy was undeniable. Under his leadership, two of the finest assault divisions in the European theater had been forged from raw recruits and green soldiers into elite combat forces. His revolutionary night attack tactics, developed decades earlier in World War I and refined across North Africa and Europe, had become a blueprint for modern warfare. And his soldiers, fiercely loyal and battle-hardened, carried forward the lessons of courage, innovation, and unflinching determination. Allies and enemies alike recognized the impact of his command. German intelligence reports whispered the name Terrible Terry Allen with caution and fear. American troops revered him as a general who led from the front, who shared in their suffering and triumph alike. Allen had earned respect not through ceremony or rhetoric, but through presence, audacity, and relentless commitment to victory. As the final German resistance crumbled, Allen reflected on a career defined by defiance, resilience, and transformation. From a West Point dropout to a feared and respected commander, his life embodied the ideals of redemption, leadership, and the unyielding American fighting spirit. In the end, Terrible Terry Allen was more than a general. He was a symbol of soldiers molded by courage, of battles won through ingenuity, and of a legacy that would endure far beyond the battlefields of Europe. The Germans feared him. His soldiers trusted him. History remembers him. May 8, 1945, Europe. Victory in Europe had been declared. The guns fell silent, and across the continent, soldiers wept, celebrated, or simply stared into the distance, haunted by what they had endured. Terry Allen stood quietly at a makeshift command post, maps scattered around him, yet his mind was elsewhere. The war was over, but the lessons, the losses, and the memories would stay with him forever. Allen never sought the spotlight. Unlike many commanders, he shunned ceremonial parades and speeches. His satisfaction came in small moments, a squad moving flawlessly under fire, a soldier saving a comrade, a young recruit finally understanding what it meant to fight with courage. Leadership, he had learned, was less about orders and more about trust, example, and relentless preparation. His approach was studied, criticized, and sometimes misunderstood by higher command. Yet time would validate his methods. Military academies would later teach his night attack strategies, his emphasis on unit cohesion, and his insistence on shared risk and visibility as central principles of combat leadership. Terry Allen's personal life, however, bore the scars of war. The loss of his son in Vietnam, years later, was a wound that no victory could heal. And yet, Allen remained steadfast, embodying the same resilience he had demanded of his troops. He understood that sacrifice was intrinsic to service, that courage often required enduring personal grief while inspiring others. Even decades later, veterans of the 1st Infantry Division and the 104th Infantry Division spoke of him with reverence. They remembered a general who walked among them in foxholes, who cursed and laughed with them, who would never ask them to risk their lives for anything less than the full measure of victory. History remembers Terrible Terry Allen not just for the battles he won, but for the soldiers he transformed, the strategies he pioneered, and the fearless spirit he embodied. From the sands of North Africa to the villages of Europe, Allen redefined what it meant to lead in war. The name Terrible Terry endures, a testament to innovation, courage, and the indomitable American spirit. Post-war years, United States. After the war, Terry de la Mesa Allen returned to a quieter life, but the echoes of combat followed him everywhere. Military historians, officers, and veterans studied his campaigns not for flamboyance or rhetoric, but for the tangible lessons of leadership, strategy, and human endurance. His divisions, the Big Red One and the Timberwolves, became case studies in how unorthodox methods, courage, and relentless training could produce elite fighting forces. Allen's story inspired a generation of soldiers and civilians alike. From the barracks of West Point to classrooms in military academies, his techniques in night assaults, small unit tactics, and frontline leadership became core teaching material. Yet beyond strategy, it was his philosophy that a leader must share the dangers of his men, earn their respect through action, and demand excellence without fear, that truly defined his legacy. But Allen's life was more than tactics and victories. It was also a tale of personal redemption. A West Point failure, dismissed and doubted, had risen to become one of America's most formidable generals. He had endured controversy, witnessed immense human suffering, and faced personal tragedy, yet he remained undaunted, principled, and committed to the men under his command. Today, museums, memorials, and countless histories preserve the memory of Terrible Terry Allen. Soldiers who follow his teachings carry forward the spirit of innovation, courage, and leadership he embodied. And though decades have passed since the battlefields of North Africa, Sicily, Belgium, Holland, and Germany fell silent, the story of Allen continues to resonate, a reminder that true leadership is forged in the crucible of adversity, not in comfort. The Germans feared him. His soldiers trusted him. And history remembers him. Terry de la Mesa Allen, Terrible Terry, stands as one of the most remarkable American generals of the Second World War, a man who reshaped battles, molded warriors, and left a legacy that will never fade. From failure to legend, from trenches to triumph, the story of Terrible Terry Allen is a testament to courage, innovation, and the enduring spirit of the American soldier. Join our mission to uncover forgotten battles. Like, subscribe, and share to keep history alive.